Hi everyone. I think we've got a quorum, so it's 7:32 and it's probably a great idea to kick off right now. My name's Cheryl Downs, but before we really go, what I'd like to do is first throw to Dan Warby.
Hi everyone. I'd just like to start off by acknowledging that we are hosting and recording this event from the lands of the Gadigal and the Wurundjeri peoples. I also acknowledge the traditional guardians of the various lands on which you all meet us from today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. I pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of this country.
Thank you very much, Dan. So again, hi everyone, and on behalf of Women Onside and Dan Warby, my co-host who's in Sydney, I'd like to welcome you all today. I am in Melbourne. Unfortunately, I don't have a mask right now, but hopefully you should all be safe. So my name is Cheryl Downs and I'm the Media Network co-convener for Women Onside, co-convening together with Dan Warby, and I'm really excited to have you here today. I think it's a great idea and a great event to see how we can get our minds together and get women working together in this media network. I'd also like to make a very special welcome and thank you already to Steph Brantz, who is a guest speaker for us, and Samantha Lewis as well. So thank you both for coming to us from Sydney. So hopefully everyone is well there. Thank you to all of you for your enthusiasm and joining us. I think the football media landscape is a really exciting one, and with the Women's World Cup coming up in just a couple of years, I'm not sure how many days, maybe it's less than 1,000 days. I think it's fantastic that we've got this coming up. Before jumping into the actual presentation, I'd like to take a moment to quickly introduce Women Onside as well. Hopefully many of you are familiar with it, but if you're not, just a very brief intro. So Women Onside is an Australia-wide network which is dedicated to making football a place where women can thrive. It was formed in July 2017 and the goal to promote gender equality in football. In the time that it's been around, the 40-40-20 principle has been adopted, a women's council was formed, and the FFA board now has a 50-50 gender split. So all of those things not necessarily directly attributed to Women Onside, but Women Onside have been part of it and delivering some great initiatives. Women Onside now comprises a diverse network of women in football and their allies. We've got interest groups covering referees, governance, supporter groups, coaching, the media network, and more to come. So all of that is great stuff, I think. We look forward to collaborating more with FFA, and we're working together with them at the moment on the 11 principle 11 as well. Just a little bit of housekeeping so that you know, we are recording this presentation tonight. If you don't want to be recorded, then I recommend that you disable your video. You will all be muted. We will get to a point where we do ask for questions, which you can either ask directly or we can read out your question for you. So just use the chat to push out those questions that you have. I just quickly go through a little bit more. We're really minimizing the PowerPoint presentations tonight because I don't want it to feel like we're talking at you. We want to be able to talk with you. So there's only a couple of slides. We'll get rid of those pretty quickly, and we hope that it's going to be a really personal approach where we can work together. If you are camera shy, like I said, and you don't want to ask your question directly, just type host at the end and we'll read that question on your behalf. Thank you very much for that. We will quickly just move on to an introduction to Steph Brantz from Dan Warby.
Yeah, so I mean, most of you are familiar with Steph Brantz and her work, but I thought I'd give a bit more detail. So in 2000, Stephanie Brantz began her television career, presenting career with SBS, appearing on The Ball with the late, great Les Murray. Between 2000 and 2010, she continued to work with SBS and Channel 9, including presenting the SBS Men's World Cup coverage and hosting Toyota World Sport. In 2010, she joined the ABC as host and sideline commentator for the W League and the WNBL. And in 2012, she led the ABC's coverage of the London Paralympics. In 2016, Steph went freelance and took on lead commentary duties for the W League with Fox Sports and joined ESPN as a host and regular contributor to ESPN FC. A big advocate for women's sport and always ready to support other women in the game. Please welcome Stephanie Brantz.
Hey, Dan. Oh, that was a resounding round of applause. How are you, Dan?
Good to see you, Steph.
Thanks, Steph. And I'll just do a quick introduction to Samantha Lewis as well. So I had the great pleasure of working with Sam Lewis back in the women's game days, leading up to the 2019 Women's World Cup in France. Sam was writing for Beyond 90 as a dedicated volunteer, and also while doing her PhD in Australian literature and gender studies. Sam's love of football basically took over from her love of academics, and fortunately for us, she hasn't looked back, as she's now a freelance journalist and doing an awesome amount of writing across a wide range of different outlets. So during the Women's World Cup, Sam was a contributor for Optus, and soon after, in August 2019, Sam commenced writing for The Guardian. Sam is now a regular panelist on the World Games show and multiple podcasts, including ours occasionally, sometimes, or maybe soon we'll add you on there, Sam. And Sam has also had pieces published by SBS, ABC, ESPN, The Equalizer, and Siren Sport. A little bit of a tidbit maybe for people is that Sam is also thinking of writing a book, so that'll be something that we'll get in early to maybe buy that one, about how As One won the bid. So feel free to throw your money or your ideas towards Sam as she thinks about what to put into that book as well. I should very quickly, and it's remiss of me to do a bit of an introduction to Danielle Warby and myself as well. Dan, on your behalf, I'll just introduce you and at least say that you're a co-founder and content producer or content strategist for Siren Sport. So many of you will have seen that, but Dan has had an illustrious career doing all sorts of things around women's sport and really has been one of the first people on the bandwagon. Then there's me. So I've sort of been on the journey, not quite as long as that, but I've had some fantastic people supporting me in my journey. I am a volunteer, but one of the first people that I started working with was Anne Odong, who many of you will know and has done a wonderful job looking after us. I started with the women's game, was there for a number of years, and I've since co-founded Beyond 90, which is a website dedicated to the positive representation of women footballers. Alrighty, back over to you, Dan.
Sam, Dan, I know it's very confusing.
It's Dr. Zeus.
Yeah. Well, Steph, so I have the pleasure of asking a few questions. Tell us first about your relationship with football media. How did it all start for you?
Yeah, and I do have to apologise for my dogs that are in the background. One is an elderly dog, and I'm looking after my son's puppy, who is not very impressed about being shut out for this next hour or so. Dan, it was an interesting journey into women's football or football in general, actually, because my background was, I started international business. That was my degree when I graduated in Brisbane. And then I moved to Sydney on a modelling contract. And after that, I was doing on-screen pieces and happened to move next door to a director from SBS, who at the time was looking for a female newsreader for the World Game. So all those kind of, I think you call the planets aligned, and I auditioned for that role or screen tested for it. I was truly appalling, and they threw the name Haile Gebrselassie at me. I will never forget his name, of course, the Ethiopian marathon runner, who I really can say very well right now. And at the time, I stumbled over it and thought, oh, maybe this is not for me. I didn't get the role that time. In fact, Mika Buchan got it, who you would know from radio in Melbourne if you're watching from there. And I was given the opportunity to train and do experience work and those sorts of things for the next, I think it was about 4.5 years. And then eventually I got the role on the World Game. From there, I went to Toyota World Sport. And after that, well, I'd like to say the rest is history, but it keeps being rewritten. I hosted Toyota World Sport alongside Les Murray for a period of time. Then I was given the solo hosting role. And then just on the cusp of the 2006 World Cup, where I hosted the highlight show for the men's FIFA World Cup in Germany, they decided to axe Toyota World Sport and pretty much all of the football. So I was looking at my options then, got a call from Channel 9, and I went there, which was, I have to say, it was a bit of a football-free zone at Channel 9 until I moved to ABC. I was offered an opportunity there, freelanced at Fox Sports in the meantime as sort of a stepping stone, and started at ABC, where they had an absolute, it was a smorgasbord of women's sport at the time. I did golf, I did hockey, basketball, and of course the W League, which was an absolute dream. And I remained attached to the W League for a long period of time. And ultimately, 2 years ago, it was Murray Shaw from Fox Sports who said, look, we'd actually really like to try a female commentator. Would you be willing to give it a go? And so I did, and it was nerve-wracking, and it was quite horrifying to have to listen to your own voice for 90 minutes. But I really enjoyed it, and obviously I've remained very much in love with women's football ever since then.
I mean, it sounds like you had a few serendipitous, episodes, sort of one after the other. Was it really that smooth, or were there some challenges and roadblocks?
There are a lot of challenges, Dan, and I think anyone getting into sports media, and this means whether you're male or female, there's always challenges. And when I started at SBS, I was the only female in that team for the World Game, and the guys were, they were great. It was fine, but you knew your place, and you weren't the host, and that's changed a lot now, and we've seen that through the years, of course, in hosting of sporting events, but at the time I didn't see it as challenging, because I think equally I was finding my way. When I went to Channel 9, I found that somewhat difficult, because I was brought into an environment where it was mainly men, and my first gig was supposed to be sideline commentator at the Ashes of 06-07 that summer. And that was tricky, because they were used to an all-male team. They were completely welcoming, and the likes of Richie Benaud, Tony Gregg, Ian Chappell, they were absolutely amazing. But you had to, I don't know, almost, you felt like you had to know more than you needed to know to be okay. So that was challenging. ABC was an absolute dream, and so embracing of women's sport, and that came to an end, of course, when, well, it was a federal budget issue actually, and we lost the Shoot Shield, the WNBL, the W League, numerous other things that needed localized outside broadcast fans. So that was nothing to do with me personally or with women's sport. It was actually a logistics issue, but there were things you just had to, I don't know, you had to take them on the chin and think, okay, I'm going to keep going and I'll find another way to do this. Eventually I went freelance, and that's been amazing. I still work with ABC. I still do the women's golf, hopefully when it comes back. And obviously with the W League, there was a partnership between Fox Sports and ABC, and that's been quite a happy marriage. I think media is always challenging, and I think that's whether you're male or female. I'm completely aware that I've been given roles because I'm female, and I have two sons. I've got 3 kids, 2 sons and a daughter, and I find that as challenging for the sons as I do for the daughter. It's, you want the right people in the role. However, we have there's a lot of ground to make up for females in media, and I'm just glad that now it seems to be a little bit more of the norm. I would like to see more women reporting on sport in general as opposed to women's football. However, if I hear a female voice and they're succinct and accurate and that they do a good job, then I'm equally happy. It's something where everyone should be given an opportunity, and I feel we're moving closer to that. There's ground to make up, but I feel we're moving closer to that.
If there was one single piece of advice you could give to someone wanting a career in football media, what would it be? I know we have a few people on the call tonight who are starting out, or they're writing for independent outlets. I mean, what kind of advice could you give all of us who want to make a go of it?
Right now, Dan, mid-COVID?
Yeah, I know, right? Sorry.
Everyone I know is now a freelancer.
Yeah.
And I'll be interested to hear Sam Lewis's take on this as well. Don't give up. You will get there. You will find opportunities. But what I've found is as long as your professional ethics and your willingness to do the job and go the hard yards is bang on, you will eventually be fine. What I found for me, and I'm talking, I started at the World Game, I think 21 years ago now, and it's all been about networks, who you meet and where you meet them, and talking to them about football and expressing your interest in the game, and one thing leads to another. So never discount the fan you meet at a game, or anyone you should meet in any of your spheres. Just keep going, keep writing, getting stuff out there. A lot of the time it might not be paid, and I have to say, and Dan, you and I have discussed this, it's difficult to talk about this at times when people are asking you to do things for free. And I want you all to bear in mind that I've been doing this for 20 years and I'm still getting asked to do things for free now because no one has a budget. However, it's about showing support, doing a good job, and hoping people remember you when this is over. And they will. The good people will come out at the end. It's just tricky. Cheryl mentioned Anne O'Donnell at the beginning. I remember interviewing Anne, and I went to meet her in Martin Place. I didn't even realize she had another job. I was like, oh, you've got a real job. Because I thought the women's game was her job, but she did it for the love of the game. And that was a real eye-opener for me. And I thought, wow, we all need to, if you believe in it, you need to support it. And that will, that's something that will come out in the end. And you'll find work. It might be a long haul, but stick in there, because if you're good, you will come out the other end.
Yeah, and I think that's really good advice. I mean, we have talked about this, and I think some things that I struggle with, and I think people probably struggle with, is when do you push for the money, and when do you go, oh no, okay, this is okay to do for free? I mean, do you have any sort of rules around that yourself?
I do. I've got corporates that I work for that they're on corporate balance sheets, and I'm well aware now of what that means. So I know approximately what they should be asking for. And to be honest, I hate asking about money. And when people will email me or call me and say, can you host this? Can you write about this? Can you be involved in this? And then they say, what do you charge? My knee jerk is to say, what's your budget? Because I'm very, very bad at asking for money. And I have had agents in the past, but equally a lot of my work comes from word of mouth. And if you do a good job, you've got to believe that someone there will have seen you. And if you're good enough, that there is that knock-on effect and a ripple effect, and you will be okay. However, the asking for money is a tricky one. And I've got to admit that as much as it pains me, my football gigs probably pay the lowest, but I'm passionate about it, and I'm aware of what the budgetary issues are. So I think it comes from where you feel in your heart you want to do the work. And if you are working for someone outside that has the budget, then you've got to be true to yourself and think, I am worth this. And that's not saying that I don't think I'm worth it to football, but equally that there's an understanding. And I've done a number of functions where they haven't had an MC, and I've said, do you want me to do it? And they said, we don't have a budget. And I thought, do you know what? I'd rather this look like a professional event. I'm happy to jump in. Would you like me to do it? And I said, there's no charge. But for me, that's it's a labor of love, because I love women's football, and I just wanted to see it professionalised and continue on that path. For yourselves, I mean, if you're a young journo who's joined us tonight, welcome to you, and I wish you all the very best in these troubling times. But know your worth, and don't be afraid to do the work experience and the hard yards to get there. But there comes a time when you have to charge for it, and other people are doing the same, and you need to go out there and say, I am worth you paying me for my opinion. And I think that's very important that we continue to do that. And that, again, that's for men, women. You know, if you are putting the work in to do this, and that includes a hell of a lot of research. And for the women's game, I can't tell you how difficult it is when you're doing research for commentary for the women's game, because you can't just Google like you can for the guys. You know, every A-League player, if you Google them, you'll come up with some sort of information. For the women's game, you've got to troll Twitter to try and find out what they're doing and what's happening in their lives, and Instagram and all those. There's a whole lot of other research, and you've got to be rewarded for that. So if you're doing the work, don't be afraid to ask for it.
Yeah, very good advice. You know, we're all, I guess, guilty of stalking players on Instagram to find out what
I didn't say I was stalking.
Speaking of stalking on Instagram, perhaps we throw over to Sam.
I just wondered if for a moment I could ask a question that's come through from the audience as well, or I think it's come through from the audience, probably to Steph, but maybe also to Sam. How do you put a dollar value on your time and services, especially when the money is a touchy subject? Don't you want to undersell or outprice yourself from the industry as well? So if we're not talking about dollars, and if I say, I'll do the work for $1 and someone else says they'll do the work for $2, you know, we're competing against each other in a very tight market. Is there any, you know, do we need to be more open about rate cards or something like that?
Cheryl, interesting question. And Sam, I'll just jump in because you've probably got a very different view to me. I call myself a freelancer. I've got 3 or 4 different contracts, and I work for the ABC, and I work for ESPN, I work for the SCG Trust, doing myriad things. But I do a lot of freelance work with hostings and MC work. And as I mentioned earlier in reply to Dan's question, a lot of the time I say, what is your budget? And they'll tell me. If I'm comfortable with that, then I consider that my price to work. Okay. If I'm not comfortable with that, then I will tell them. I get somewhat irritated when I hear that they are paying someone else more. And that's usually a profile thing. Like if you're working in football, they may pay someone from Fox Sports or from Optus more. And I just think, you know what, as long as I'm happy with what I'm being paid, and I consider that a price for leaving home. If I'm going to sit at home and do nothing and watch the game on TV, that's great. If I'm happy, perfect. If I can be paid X amount to go and host an event and to do interviews and to write something on it, then I negotiate what price that I'd be happy with. But to be honest, I always think that if I'm being paid to leave home and watch football, I consider it a bonus. So I'm perhaps a little bit biased, but equally, as long as you're happy, I think that's where you need to be. It's very difficult. I did a number of corporate functions where I found out what the guest speakers were paid, and we were talking in the tens of thousands of dollars, and I was nowhere near that as the MC for 3 days. But I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great to be an ex-Olympian or a keynote speaker, all that sort of thing? And I thought, you know what, I'm actually happy being where I am, and they now need to deliver for that amount of money. In these current times, it's a completely different market because we are all sitting at home going, I need to be paid. So I'm interested to hear Sam's take on it. But for me, what you want to be paid is what you're happy with. And if you're happy with 200, 500, 1,000, 2,000, 20,000, set your mark, but be aware that you are in competition with the rest of the market.
Cool.
Yeah, wow. Let me just write down $20,000. Yeah, look, my experience is quite different, obviously, because I'm pretty new to journalism. My background is not in journalism at all. I came from doing a number of degrees in literature. I never thought that football journalism was something that I could enter and make a living from. If I had known that 10 years ago when I first decided to go to uni, I probably would have chosen a very different path. But yeah, the last year for me, I operate as a freelancer. I'm a freelance writer, and the most beneficial thing for me in terms of like answering this particular question is actually understanding the sort of the freelance rates of all of the different publications that accept pitches from freelancers. So a number of different publications offer vastly different amounts of money, depending on a number of things, depending on, as Steph mentioned, who you are, depending on how much you write, how much research goes into it, and where it's going. And you can find that out if you dig. But again, because talking about money is still a little bit of a taboo, I feel like we don't really talk about these kinds of things very often. And I think, Dan, you and I had a conversation about this a number of months ago where you said that one of the things that Siren Sport is wanting to do is to collate a spreadsheet of all of the freelance rates that are going for writers. And that's such an important, I think, resource to have, particularly for writers who are wanting to enter into mainstream journalism. And I came from a fan background. I came from a volunteer writing background. I started at the women's game. In fact, before that, I started just tweeting because I didn't see anything on social media that was reporting the games that I was watching. And so I took it upon myself to start doing it anyway. So I moved from there to the women's game. I moved from the women's game to Beyond 90. And it just so happened that a couple of pitches and a couple of ideas that I had, which I had just emailed off to a bunch of different editors, some of them stuck. And that's sort of how it goes. But, you know, even though I feel like I've generated quite a significant sort of profile, particularly over the last 6 to 8 months, there is so much work that has not been published that I've done. There are so many pictures, so many stories that I have put together and sent out to a whole bunch of different people that have been turned down. And that's one of the sacrifices that you have to make as a freelancer. You're going to do so much more work than what you're going to be rewarded for it. But eventually, as Steph sort of mentioned, the more you do it, eventually you'll get some sort of reward for it. You'll get noticed. You'll have people talking about you because you're doing good work and you're dedicated. And that's the reason that Anne O'Dong is Anne O'Dong, is because she spent 10 years doing the women's game voluntarily while she had a full-time job actually to support herself and to pay her bills and to put food on the table. So, I mean, I do think media generally for football is in a much better space, obviously, than what it was when Anne was doing that. But it still does take quite a lot of sacrifice. And for example, I still have another job on the side of my writing. I'm a high school English tutor. That's to make sure that I still have consistent money to pay my bills, to, pay rent, to do all that sort of stuff. And also I'm on Job Seeker. Like a lot of people in media, I've had to go on Job Seeker as well. And I don't think I would have been able to sustain the amount of writing that I've done over the last couple of months if I didn't have that Job Seeker support there. So even though I sort of feel like I've gotten to a position that's a little bit elevated above the sort of your Beyond 90s and women's games sort of fan zone sort of writing, and I'm actually able to be paid for a lot of my work now, I'm still not near having a full-time sort of job in the media. I don't really consider myself a journalist in that sense. I don't have journalism training. I'm just a fan who is sometimes pretty good at writing about it. And I've managed to be very lucky in having a lot of people who have given me a chance, being able to pitch different ideas and different stories to certain organisations that I've put research into and that I've pitched to organisations knowing that that's the kind of thing that they would go for. You would pitch an idea very differently to a Guardian than you would to an SBS or to an ESPN or to an ABC. And so understanding the landscape generally and how your story or your idea can fit into each of those different kinds of brands is also quite important when it comes to wanting to be a proper freelancer. But yeah, so it's still really tough, and unfortunately a lot of the decisions that are made when it comes to whether or not women freelancers are supported are made by men in positions of power in the media. I haven't had an editor who is a woman before, aside from Cheryl and Anne at Beyond 90 and the Women's Game. So all of the mainstream publications that I write for, all of the decisions are made by men. They're all white men. There are a number of problems, I think, with that as well, and that's hopefully something we can dig into a little bit further on in this webinar. But yeah, I mean, I think that it is getting better, and the fact that we're sort of all sitting here and having this conversation and having a sort of a central space to meet and to talk about these ideas, I think is a really good start.
So we've got a couple of questions coming in from the audience as well, and it'd be good to pop into those. But I just wanted to share something that I remember having a conversation with Anne O'Dong at one point in time, and it highlights that we need to have, if you are volunteering in your writing and you're starting out in your journey and trying to put together a bit of a portfolio. I remember Anne already had the portfolio, but she had an accommodating employer. And I remember one time her boss had come up to her in the office and she just said, he wanted to give her something to do. And she said, I'm busy. And he said to you, are you football busy or work busy? And she said, football busy. But it didn't make a difference to him because he knew that she was doing the right amount of work. But he was giving her the time when she needed the time to curate that kind of stuff as well. So I do think in the volunteer landscape, it is important to have an employer who either understands or supports what you're doing, or you find a new employer, or you try and really take a risk and go out there and do some freelance work. So that was a good story. If I jump to one of the questions that I can see come through to me privately, and the question is from someone I know who actually does some writing already for one of the football federations, but maybe isn't necessarily paid for the work that they do. How would you go about talking to a federation to ask them for some sort of payment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Pretty much, I think the sort of the same way that you would probably approach any media organisation. You would talk about the contributions that you've been making, and you would have a wider context that you can take to them and say, in this particular circumstance, this person would be paid X amount of money for this amount of work. And that's, again, why having some sort of spreadsheet about freelance rates is a really good tool to have in your back pocket, so that you can go to these organisations and say, actually, the amount of work that I'm doing is worth something to these people over here. And so I feel like I deserve to be paid that amount of money for what I'm doing here. And if they're not able to accept that, I mean, that's sort of one of the difficult moments that you have to go through, I think, where you decide whether or not you want to keep working for them. And I really appreciated what Steph said before about knowing your worth. I think that's really, really important. And it's something especially that women really need to be reminded of, because we are so easily sort of trained out of that, particularly when it comes to sport, because so many sports writers, myself included, started off as fans. We started off as volunteers, and we were driven by the love and the passion for the game. And I worry sometimes that passion and love is sort of it's sort of used almost as an excuse to not be paid sometimes. It's the thing that, because we've always done it and because we will do it regardless of if we get paid, that it's sort of used as an excuse not to do it. And we almost internalize that sometimes as well. It's certainly something I had to train myself out of when I decided to pursue writing full time, and I actually really needed to make sure that I was being paid what I was worth. And so having context, talking to more people who are doing the kinds of things that you're doing as well, and getting information from them, breaking down that taboo of for some reason it's still weird to talk about how people get paid and how women get paid in sport. Trying to sort of break down that barrier and have that conversation, I think, is really important. So that you go into a meeting with a boss, a media manager, someone at a federation, whatever, having information at your disposal and being able to go to them and put it all on the table and say, this is what I'm worth, and I feel like you need to pay me for that.
Sam, I think you're absolutely right. And you need to know your worth and understand it and be confident with it. Having said that, I would also recommend, perhaps if you have published work, take it to the media manager of a club. Because my one gripe, and this is particularly women's football, and I think it exists also for A-League in the men's game, is that the personal stories are so valuable. And sometimes the media managers are so busy with the minutiae of running the media side of a club that they don't look to push that out there. And I think if you take them a story and then tell them, this is worth X to me, and what do you pay your writers, and can I come and help you, like offer yourself as this is what I can do for you. The value on that's a complete other story, but there has to be some way for us to tell the football stories of Australia and get them out there, because I think that's somewhere we completely fall down. It doesn't matter if it's a male you're approaching or a female. I've never had trying to think if I've had a female boss. No, I haven't. Maybe once at the ABC for a short period of time. But the men were no less supportive than the female. All of my mentors in my career have been male, and they have been invaluable in what they've done for me. It's got nothing to do with what they thought of my gender. They were only concerned with how they could progress my career or how I could use my skills. And that's been something that I've been eternally grateful for. There's also been men and women that have been completely unhelpful in my career, but I think then that's up to your personal judgment of what they can do for you. And if you approach the right people, then again, what I mentioned before about networks, they will remember you and put you in touch with people and so on and so forth. But what Sam was saying is writing, and don't forget that Sam and I come from very different aspects, because my background is not as a writer and Sam's is, and an incredibly talented one. Mine came from presenting, and that's a completely different avenue to come from. If you're a professional athlete, presenting is apparently a shoe-in these days. You don't need to train for it, but writing is a lot more difficult. And I think that these days, particularly in the social media landscape, people can look at what you write and mull over it forever, and then everyone's allowed to comment on it. And I think sometimes that's very hurtful. And for new writers, just putting their stuff out there, you know what, we're all entitled to our opinion, but on social media, everyone apparently can also shoot you down. So you can't get disheartened by that, but find someone that believes in you. I don't care who they are. Find someone that is going to build you up and objectively and critically look at your work and say, this is good, this is not, you should continue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Can I jump back in on that? Because you raised so many good points, Steph, there. The importance of having a mentor, I think, it's invaluable, honestly. And Anne O'Dong was my mentor when I first started writing. And there were some pieces that I put together and sent to her for editing that she absolutely demolished. And that was a really good learning experience for me, because I didn't know what I was doing. And she had so much experience and so much knowledge, and she knew how to tell a great story. And so having her there, having her as an editor and having her as a friend, someone who I knew had my best interests at heart and was wanting me to be better and was trying to show me how to be better, that was really important for me as well. And so I think one of the great things about having this media network is that we can actually start to perhaps think about a sort of a mentor-mentee program in that sense, or like a sort of a big little sister kind of thing, where we can pair writers who are just emerging from volunteer spaces, perhaps with more established writers who have more familiarity with the landscape in terms of payment, but also in terms of the kinds of writing that is more catered to certain kinds of publications than others, and how to sort of train emerging writers in that sort of sense as well. But like sort of on top of that, what you mentioned about networking, I think, is also really important. You know, I think football in particular is sort of dismissed sometimes as a sort of, it's who you know, not what you know sort of space. But you need to know stuff for people to know who you are. You know, it's not a bad thing, because especially in women's sport is built on its community. And so if you are part of its community and you are doing good work and you are being recognized by people in that community, that's a great thing. And your name is going to spread, your work is going to spread, and more people are going to know who you are. And that's why having a good social media presence also matters, particularly for younger people who are wanting to emerge into writing in sort of more mainstream publications. Having a really good social media presence and knowing how to work social media it really matters in terms of building your network and your profile online as well.
Yeah, a couple of really good segues for something. Sorry, Dan, to cut you off. I just wanted to throw to Rachel Bach, who we've also got on the call. And I know that we've talked about Anne O'Dong and how she's supported so many of us in taking another step in where we are right now as well. And also talking about the different kind of roles that we have versus, you know, if it's written journalism or if it's sports presenting. Rachel Bach is there, and we'll just try and find her and unmute her as well, and just talk about a little bit of a different journey that you have when you are behind the camera, and, you know, your presence is a little bit different. But Rach, I know particularly with By the White Line, has really been developing a presence there as well. Rach, if you're happy to share just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So as Shez mentioned, I run By the White Line, which started as a bit of a space just for me to showcase some of my work separate to a personal Instagram account. So I started taking photos of women's football in 2016. It wasn't something that I studied or particularly dreamt of doing. It was more, I was studying multimedia design. I was just interested in kind of merging my passion for sport and design. And was fortunate enough to meet Anne O'Dong, as I think many of us were, very early on. So about, I think, 4 games into my career, I met Anne at a Matildas game in Ballarat. And a short while later, I actually met Shez at an NPL game locally in Melbourne, and basically connected with both of them and got a chance to shoot in W League later that year. And so for the first couple of years, everything I was doing was voluntary, and I absolutely loved what I was doing. In 2018, hopped on a plane and went to Jordan for the Asian Cup. And again, like, it was just one of those experiences that, you know, I wanted to do. I took time off from my full-time job, paid for it all myself. I wasn't really thinking about ever making it into a career. And then at the end of, well, towards the end of that year, a colleague of mine at my full-time job, which was not related to sport in any way, shape or form, said to me, you know, would you ever consider, you know, would you want to work in football full-time? And I actually laughed. And I said to her, you know, no one's going to pay me to do this, let alone to do it full-time. You know, I hadn't made a single cent shooting any W League or Matildas or anything for, you know, 3 years basically. And 2 weeks later, I was very lucky to get an opportunity with Nike. And so I quit my job and ended up following some of the builders all through last year, throughout Australia and through America. I went to Turkey for pre-camp for the World Cup, the Netherlands, and then to France, of course. France was actually, well, because Nike didn't sponsor the tournament, I actually went there as a volunteer, so I kind of reverted into a familiar old role. But yeah, I think through all of this, the experiences I've had kind of shifting from being a volunteer into making this into a full-time gig, it definitely hasn't been easy in terms of the challenges that I've faced. I'm very, very used to being the only woman in the photography working room. you know, I'm constantly fielding comments such as, oh, that lens looks heavy for a little girl, which, you know, you just kind of, I don't even engage anymore. Comments from other photographers at W League games, oh, you know, you don't need a photography bib, it's just the W League. And so those sorts of things have become, I don't know, I try to tune them out now. But by the same token, it's also been probably one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. And I didn't ever intend to make it into a career. But, you know, I wouldn't change anything that I've done really. And I think Sam makes a really good point about social media presence and how important that is and how important that's been for me. Like without it, there's just no way I would have had any of the opportunities that I've had. And it's not to say that I've mastered the algorithm by any means. My kind of strategy is to just post. I mean, the way I kind of talk about By the White Line now is that it feels a bit like my diary. I'm just kind of telling the stories of what happens and what I observe. But I think it's hugely important to have these discussions with other people within the media, and especially women in media. It's not, I know in my field, it's really not hugely common, but it's something that I would love to, you know, I would love to see more women on the sidelines with me. And when that does happen, like I know in the last couple of years, you know, I might shoot a game and there might be 4 other female photographers that I know, and it becomes this thing of, oh, we should all get a photo together because it's such a rarity. And I would really love for that to stop and for that just to become the norm. So anything that I can do, or, you know, I'm always happy to answer questions about the wild world of photography. So
I think one of the things that Rachel's done is really build a great portfolio in one respect, but also build and develop the trust and rapport with the players, because they open themselves up to you in a way that we haven't seen before. I think in terms of the Matildas and the W League players as well. And I don't know whether or not that was a conscious strategy from you, but I think the media is not necessarily always something that is trusted. But through you being, you know, the genuine person that you are, I think that's really worked well with your brand as well.
Yeah, I think on the note of trust with players, I think that probably, I mean, I think I kind of fostered those relationships in showing that I was there for the right reasons. And so, you know, a lot of it came from my early days volunteering. You know, it was offering players photos of themselves and making sure that someone was there to capture those moments. Because
Rachel, I completely agree with that, because I started working in women's football maybe 13, 14 years ago, and no one was interested in it then. Yeah. And the players remember that you were there, and they that actually fosters those relationships, and I think that's really important. And I completely heed what you say about you know, the female photographers, because you just don't see a lot of them. You don't see a lot of women in the media room. You don't see a lot of women around the game, apart from the specific roles that seem to be pertinent to women. I'm not saying that's a sexist thing. It's just that something that it has to evolve over time. I know that a lot of us have mentioned Anne O'Dong tonight, and I did text her saying, where are you? Because you're getting a lot of love. She's actually working late to get more content on women and girls in football. So she's living the dream. But you know, I said to her that a lot of us relate to what she was doing, because she was one, like you, Rachel and Sam, you start doing it for the love of the game and for the love of the women's game. And I think the female players remember that potentially more than they would in the men's game. I'm not saying that the men's game is particularly different, but it's a lot more competitive in terms of media and in terms of where they go as far as their career goes. Rachel, you made me laugh when you said about people saying, that lens is really heavy and those sorts of things. I've moved a lot more into production over the last few years because I'm about 10 years too old to present. So I figured that was my next avenue. And I worked with FIFA Films and FIFA TV, and we actually got a gig following the Socceroos. And we went to Chinese Taipei, and there was one Australian reporter there. And we were obviously with FIFA, so it was the host broadcast. And it was actually quite hilarious because I said to my cameraman, you go over to that touchline, I'm going to bring the equipment. So I was carrying a tripod and the lens bag and some other equipment, and I'm 6 foot tall and perfectly capable. I had 3 people come up and offer to help me carry it. And I was actually mortified. I thought, do you know what, if a guy was carrying this, no one would get, it would be de rigueur and normal. And then when we were going back to the van, my cameraman was too embarrassed to let me carry the tripod. He said, it makes me look bad. So I completely.
I think that's the thing. Yeah, I know that when I was in Turkey, and Ish Ferguson was there with Optus, and she would constantly be picking up, gear from her cameraman, and there'd be this little struggle of who carries it and who should. And I think having those moments really makes you realise sometimes how rare we are.
If anyone has seen Isha's 2-footer tackle to get her fastest red card in the World Cup, they wouldn't argue with it.
Hey, Rach, thank you very much for sharing some of your story and sticking around. And we will make sure that we try and keep everyone together for some media networks in the future. But I want to throw back to Dan for a bit because I keep cutting Dan off, but it's all yours now, Dan.
Well, it's actually, I just have a question from the floor from Angela George. And I think maybe Rach could offer some insight into this because it does mention social media and you're a bit of a star there with your photos. So Angie's a volunteer content writer and social media manager. And she'd like some tips on how to raise the profile of the players that she writes about. What hot tips do you have for her?
Raising the profile. I think with social media, it's one of those things where you have to really pick the right platform. And I think sometimes, especially with writing and what I've noticed, my main platform is Instagram. And that makes sense because what I do is visual. And Instagram, I think, is quite limited, with embedding links, as an example. Click-through rates are really low if you're just linking through a bio or something. And so I think in terms of raising profiles, it's also about how you can get the players to share things. I think that's super important. It's about talking to them and making them see the value in pushing content that's about them. I think that's something that sometimes players don't necessarily realize, and they're not trained in social media. And how to kind of help themselves sometimes in terms of profile. And so I think kind of talking to them is really important, but at the same time, it's then, well, which platform makes the most sense for writing? In my mind, it's Twitter. That's, where I go to read or find any articles about anything. So I think that's a really important point, is picking your platform carefully and then working out, well, who can help me share this? And sometimes it's actually the people that are in the article.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Rach. I would sort of elaborate on that as well. Like, knowing the kind of content that you're wanting to share, I think, is important as well. And considering football in the last couple of years has moved quite digital, where so much of the content is not so much in a written form, but it's in the form of small videos, it's in the form of other types of clickable digital sorts of nuggets of goodness. If you're able to perhaps start to move into that space in a way that is engaging with the players and with your audience as well, that might be another idea. But yeah, absolutely knowing the platform that you're wanting to use is really, really important. And the thing as well, I think it comes down to the players, because players, particularly if they're wanting to be professionals, they are a brand. and they need to understand the fact that they are a brand. And so encouraging them to have a social media presence and encouraging them to engage in online communities, I think, is a good start as well. In that way, if you're engaging in wanting to share information and articles and photos, videos, whatever about them, you can tag them and you can actually incorporate them as the brand, as the character, as the player into that wider sort of conversation and that network. And so if you get to a point where you're interviewing players and you're writing pieces about them, and then they start to share those pieces to their wider networks, and then their networks start to share it, that's the good stuff. That's what you want.
Sam, you're absolutely right. It's that ripple effect, and Rachel will know that a picture's worth 1,000 words, and you can post a picture, and with the right hashtags and the right Twitter handles and tags, you can get that posted out there. But finding, for those of you that want to write, and Sam would well understand that, it's finding that hook. And often when I write pieces, the headline will be changed and I'll look at it and think, oh, that's actually not what I wanted to write, because I'm not a particularly controversial person. But that's what gets clickbait, which unfortunately is the society that we live in. It's forever for my it's not my disappointment, but I'm perhaps a little bit befuddled by the fact that the highest clickbait I ever got for a story of mine is where Usain Bolt was headed after the Mariners. And I was mortified by it because I was asked by employers in the US about Usain Bolt, and I went, he can't play football. And it was like, oh, let's do a story on him, and everyone here is interested in it. And the amount of clicks it got, and to my constant disappointment, it was the night in Campbelltown where I actually scored a goal. And I thought, really, of all the nights, you could have just disappeared. Never. And he scored, and it became all about, will the Central Coast Mariners sign him? And Sean Mielecamp at the Mariners was absolutely wonderful and completely realistic about the publicity that it brought the club, and that's what it had done. And I thought, I cannot believe I'm writing on a sprinter who can't play football, and that is going to be the biggest clickbait of my entire writing career. So it's finding what you can hang that hook in. I'd like to sort of extrapolate that to the women's game, and I've been watching Hayley Raso for I don't know how many years, and looking at her and what a talented player she is, how far she is down the wing. And it wasn't until she had to break her back for mainstream media to start writing about her, which, I mean, she's come out the other side and she's amazing. But I thought, do you know what? She was great before that. It's just that it's finding that hook. And Sam, I think you'd completely understand that you need something to hang your story on. So if you can find that way to pitch your story to a publication, a website, or any platform that will take that, or a hashtag, anything like that, that is how you get the clickbait and the following to get the recognition that you want.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, can I quickly talk about clickbait? Because I think it's a really important topic, and one of the traps that I think a lot of sport media falls into is the idea of trying to sensationalize everything. Like everything is just the most amazing thing that has ever happened, or it's the most dramatic, or it's the most whatever, because that's sort of what gets our attention. And I feel like the risk of doing that is that when something actually really serious does happen, or really exciting, it sort of falls a little bit flat, because we've already used up so much of our sort of sensational language on all these clickbaity headlines. But when it comes to pitching stories, like a lot of my stories, because I'm personally quite interested in the way that larger structures affect players and women in football, I often write about quite conceptual things. I'm trying to write a lot more about human stories, and I think that of all the stories that I've ever written, the ones that tend to hit the most and the ones that tend to get the most feedback, the most comments, are the ones that are about people. They're about human stories that are really relatable to all of us. They're about people going through things like the Hayley Raso breaking her back story. You know, it wasn't a story about breaking her back. It was about resilience, and it was about the support team that she had around her. And it's about the ability to come back from some sort of massive setback that a lot of us are able to relate to. So finding human angles for stories, I think, is really important. And that's sort of one of the reasons why I'm almost grateful that I didn't come through a journalism degree and I came through a literature degree, is because all of the great novels, all of the great poems, the great films, the great plays of the world are about human stories, and they're about stories that we can all connect with in one way or another. So I would actually encourage everyone to read more. If you want to know how to write well, you need to read a lot. You need to read a lot of really good writing. Read a lot of good writing, not just in journalism, but outside of it. What are the stories that affect you? The stories that you really love, that really move you? And how do those stories work? Pull those stories apart, try and figure out what makes them tick. And then take those kinds of lessons, take those kinds of literary techniques. This is my Sam Lewis high school English teacher coming to the fore here, and incorporate those into your writing, because that's effectively what's going to make you stand out from everybody else. You need to be able to find what's different about your voice, what's different about your perspective, and be able to offer that to everybody else.
Yeah, that's certainly key. And, you know, one of the things I think we definitely need in the media landscape is more different and diverse perspectives. So, you know, it is important, I think, to look at your own and what you bring to the table. So I did have a questions that are leading on from that, which is around getting access to players. You know, I know some of the folks on the call starting out would be interested to know what the best way is to approach players when you work in the media. You know, it's getting harder and harder just to walk up to them on the sidelines now. So what advice do you have about that?
If I can jump in here, Dan, and I know that you and I have had similar issues in the past, because you know a lot of the players, because you've worked with them in the past and you've been there from when they were 15 years old. In fact, just to digress for a moment, we did have a letter come to the ABC when I started in commentary saying, can you please tell your commentator not to refer to them as girls? And bear in mind, I've got an 18-year-old daughter, and these players were 3 years younger than her. Like, they were 15, 16, 17. And I was like, no, they're girls, but we had to just refer to them as players, which, do you know what? I accept. I took it on board and went, yep, no, that's fine. But to me, I'd seen these girls grow up. Sorry, these players grow up. And so to me, I had their phone numbers and I could text them directly. But equally, there is a pathway you should use, and for complete professionalism, if you don't know them, it's fine, ring the media manager, and if you get them, great, and you should, because there is no media manager that should turn out a story for women's football. However, for me, it was a combination of check with the player that they're good to talk, then speak to the media manager and get them to set it up. And I know that Danielle and I have spoken about this. If you get no report, then you go back to the player if you don't get a response, and you can manage it like that. But certainly if you can build a relationship with the players, and that comes from being on the sideline, being in the press conference, interviewing them for whatever publication or non-publication or website or anything like that, just showing interest and support in the women's game. Because as professionals we say it is, I still go to matches where there's, 600-800 people there, and you can literally name everyone in the crowd. They will remember you. So build your relationships, and then those players will go on to become Matildas, and they will remember that you were there at the start. But you must also be respectful of the fact that there are media managers who'd like you to go through the correct channels. I don't know if Sam or Rachel have had different experiences, but certainly it's something that you must respect the proper way to do it through the club. But 9 times out of 10, you will end up with a player if you've got that relationship. And I've had that come out in spades with Sam Kerr at the World Cup, where she wasn't doing any media, and I was working for FIFA TV. And I knew we only had 2 questions. And she came out and she said, don't worry, Steph, I'll make them long ones. Because she knew that I could only ask 2, but I needed a lot more information. And so when you have that relationship, it'll pay off in spades in the end. But that's a long time in the making. That's a 7-8 year relationship to make that happen.
Yeah, I might jump in on that as well. If you're new to this and you don't have those pre-existing relationships with players and they have no idea who you are, it's always best practice and it's always most professional to go through a media manager. Always. You don't want to put anybody in any of the clubs offside by sort of making them feel like you're undermining them or going behind their back to contact players privately. And the other thing is that players are private people. They can be quite private. And if you contact them out of the blue saying that you're a journalist wanting to write a story about X, Y, and Z, they may not take very kindly to that. Particularly if you contact them privately through a social media channel. So I think it's always really important to go through a media manager first if you don't already have that pre-existing relationship with the player and you know that they're comfortable talking to you already, in which case you still will need to go through a media manager once you know that they're going to want to talk to you. It's always good to just be upfront. I think it's always good practice to be upfront with everybody so that nobody is on the wrong page about anything that you're trying to do.
If you're accredited media as well, in the events where you have mixed zone, there's an opportunity for you, or in the post-match press conferences or something as well. I mean, you don't necessarily get the choice of player. Sometimes the media managers will ask which player you might want to ask a question of. But, open yourself up, take a little step off the edge and put yourself out there as well. The players put themselves out there. They don't always enjoy it, as you guys have been saying. So take a little bit of a risk yourself, but always be professional in the questions that you ask and consider them as a player and try and tell their story. It's not just about the story that you want to tell. Really try and engage with them and see what it is that they want to say. I think, help them.
Yeah, Cheryl, that's a really good point. And you mentioned mixed zones, which I'm not sure how many people new to media we've got with us. That's the all-in at the end of a match, where he who shouts or she who shouts the loudest probably gets the most questions in. But that's where your networks come in. If a player recognises you and they feel comfortable with you, then they will talk to you. But Sam mentioned about trust, and that's really important because a lot of our players, and this is men and women, they have lives. They're people off the pitch, and it's really important not to burn them. And I know you'll get a headline if you write something controversial, but be very sure that that's what you want to do, because when you build that trust, you'll be able to speak to them forever. And they're the ones that will look at you in a mixed zone, in a host, say at a World Cup when there's 40 different journalists, and they'll pick you out and they will actually come over and answer your questions. And that, as a journalist or a reporter, feels like a very good thing, but equally you've earned that through the years. It's not something that you can just get like that.
Very good. Just a bit of a time check at the moment. We probably went quite off script, but I actually think it was a really good organic conversation. And we've got a lot of questions that have come in from the audience. I don't think that we necessarily have the time to answer all of them. We'll try and answer
Go on, ask as many. No, I'm not doing anything. Ask as many as you want.
Cheryl, do a shotgun. You got 10 seconds to answer this question.
All right, that sounds, I'm just going to do what Steph tells me.
Yeah, good philosophy.
You sound like one of my kids.
So we've got one question here, which has come from the Philippines, I believe, in Southeast Asia. And it's basically about burnout. And if you've probably got any hints or tips about if you're a one-man band or a one-woman band, how do you actually manage yourself and your contribution? Because, you're trying to do the best thing out of your heart to get some coverage for women's football. But how do you manage the flip side of that being your own burnout?
Yeah, good question. I suppose it depends on your context. It depends on how much support you have around you while you're trying to work. I treat my job as a 9 to 5, even though I'm a freelancer and even though I do work a lot of weekends and I spend a lot of time outside of the 9 to 5 window doing interviews and going to meetings and doing all that sort of thing. I still I really value my mental health. And that's actually one of the reasons why I quit my PhDs, because for young career researchers, early career researchers, you're expected to go above and beyond what you would usually do in a 9-to-5 job in order to get ahead. And there are definitely some days that you have, and even some weeks as a freelance journalist, where you feel exhausted. There are some days that don't finish until 4 o'clock in the morning, but you are able to, I think, balance that out, knowing what your own limits are, and knowing that if you are able to manage your time efficiently and you're able to keep a really good schedule, and you're always making sure that you do all the good mental health, self-care types of things, you're getting enough sleep, you're getting exercise, you're eating well, you're making time for yourself, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. Sometimes there are some little sprints here and there, but ultimately it's a marathon, and you need to take care of yourself and your brain, because you're a journalist and what you're offering is information and knowledge and writing. And so if your brain is not there and it's not working and it's not doing well because you're not giving yourself the opportunity to rest, your work is going to suffer. So I think it's really important to take care of yourself, because it means that your work is going to be better.
Gee, Sam, you can tell you work in the written press. I work in television, where 10 seconds means 10 seconds.
Sorry.
But I completely agree. You've got to be true to yourself. You need to be able to eat and support your lifestyle. If it's not doing it for you, then you continue doing what you're passionate about, but don't lay your whole life on the line for this. You will find something. If it's meant to be, you will find something. Keep doing it, and find that network. You'll find something, but don't forget what Sam said about mental health. Seriously, your job is not worth losing your sanity over, ever.
Right.
That was 11 seconds, Sam.
Yeah, okay, keep bragging, that's fine.
I've
So
got
I've got a question if we have time, Cheryl.
pardon me.
I've got a question from the audience if we have time.
Go for it. Yep.
Okay, so this is from Karen, and this is sort of really pertinent to next steps. So what would you like to see happen now in the media landscape in the lead up to the Women's World Cup? So for example, what opportunities would we be thinking about as a collective to leverage it for women's sport and female journos?
Jobs in media would be good for a start, but we've seen what that looks like in the landscape at the moment. I would like to see the stories being told, and I'm not even talking about the Matildas here or the teams from the UEFA Confederation or those sorts of things. I want to hear these amazing stories about women's football, about the regions that have tried so hard to come to Australia, because we're going to have that expanded World Cup. It's going to be amazing. One thing that sticks with me from France, I remember I was working for the host broadcaster, so I was doing the Visa Player of the Match interview, and you're allowed one question. And the question, we had a list of 5 questions that I was allowed to ask. And so Sam, she'd scored so many goals in that particular match, and I was like, no, please, I'll have Sam Kerr. And said to her, what stood out for you from this World Cup? And do you know what she said? She said, the Thailand team, when they scored their first goal, it was like they'd won the World Cup. And that really resonated with her. And I was thinking, I actually want to hear this story. I want to hear what it took for them to make this. And if we can get those stories out there and tell everyone how wonderful women's football is, it's not all about the money or the sponsors, or it's just about being on the stage and hearing the human interest stories about what people go through to play the game they love.
Yeah, absolutely. More stories. I mean, more jobs would obviously be amazing. But unfortunately, we're not in that situation at the moment. And even really established journalists have been losing their jobs, journalists who've been working in football for 15, 20 years. So because of that, I think because of the direction in which traditional media are going, I think we have a really good opportunity to find alternatives and to build alternative media networks like the one we have here, like using social media and digital platforms to really elevate women's stories. And I think one of the most, speaking of social media, there was a conversation on Twitter today. If anybody follows Mary Constantopoulos, who runs Ladies Who League, she tweeted today about why we don't have, for example, a women's sport TV network. So like sort of starting to have conversations with people in the community about alternatives for how we can help each other, I think is probably the first big step. And that's why having a media network like this is really important. And I'm hoping that Women Onside has like a central Slack or a Facebook page or something where we can brainstorm and we can have discussions about the things that we can offer. And obviously a really good example of this is Siren Sports, what Dan Warby has established, this fantastic newsletter which just showcases, you know, women's sports stories, has really great writers, they pay, you know, which is great. But finding alternatives to the kinds of traditional media platforms that we're used to, and therefore finding alternative storytelling methods as well. Because I think one of the most boring parts of media is just the very plain vanilla, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Nobody, I think, particularly in my generation, is really interested in those kinds of stories anymore. We don't need match reports of games because clubs already produce them. We don't need the sort of the X, Y, Zs, the nuts and bolts of things. I mean, we've got like an AAP, sort of a newswire service for that, but the things that really get people interested in the women's game, like I said before, are the human stories. Their interviews, their anecdotes, their memories. They're a lot more sort of English literature types of stories that we really connect with emotionally and with our imaginations, and that really inspire us. So trying to lean more, I think, towards those kinds of storytelling methods, as opposed to just writing your basic sort of match reports, the things that everyone else is doing. Trying to find something that makes you different as a writer and finding a way to connect with your audience in more emotional and sort of creative ways. I think that's probably the future for women's sport journalism.
Sam, I'm now thinking of you as the Charlotte Bronte of women's football. Can I just add something? Sorry, Cheryl and Danielle, I think you're trying to probably wind us up. I completely agree. I would like to see some sort of platform where it's easily relatable to get the women's sport content. I'm just acutely conscious of the fact that when with ESPNW, and I obviously work with ESPN, they're one of my employers, they did this specific women's platform and did a specific women's channel and a website. And I remember a friend of mine saying to me, why would I specifically go to that? If I just saw it on the main site, I'd click on it. I wouldn't specifically go to a women's site to click on it. So I think we need to find some balance. I completely heard what they were saying, and equally supporting this is where you go for your women's sport content, but we need to make sure there's links with mainstream platforms, media, socials, all that sort of thing, so that we don't actually take ourselves out of that element.
Yeah, well, as a content strategist, I can tell you can do both. The one piece of content could be disseminated into many places. So you can have your W, and then you can also sit in with the rest of the site. So there you go.
And then we've all got jobs. Excellent.
And we've all got
We've saved it. Congratulations, everyone.
Can I just say one more thing? Sorry, I have the feeling you're going to wind us up in a minute. I want to tell you, and I spoke to Danielle about this earlier in the week. I had dinner with Sam actually last week, and I had no idea that she wasn't a full-time journo at any of the places that she writes for. You need to reach out. You need to tell people what you're doing. If you want to get involved in the industry, get in touch. Through Danielle or Cheryl, you could get in touch with me, and I may not be able to help you, but I can point you to people that can. Just don't get in touch and say that you want to know how to host this, that, or the other that I'm already doing, because that's quite competitive. But saying, you know, can you advise me on who I should get in touch with, or can you help me, or can you have a look at this, or things like that. We're actually all there to support other people. And this is men or women who are trying to get into media. We're all there to support you. So if you do it respectfully, we can all help each other out, and we can all have jobs.
Yeah. Can I just quickly jump on just at the end of that? Just really quickly. Just one last thing. I feel like a lot of this conversation has been aimed at emerging writers, at people who are trying to crack into the industry. But I have noticed that there are a couple of people on the call who are already in the industry. And I think they also have a responsibility to throw the ladder down, to actually use the platform that you have in the industry to give opportunities to other people, to give other people a chance, basically. That's the only reason that I'm here, is because I had a couple of editors who took a complete gamble, not knowing who I was or what I was about. They took a go on me, and I was able to deliver something to them that they liked. And that's how a lot of that works. But I never would have got here where I am now if other people didn't take a chance on me. So it does take a lot of effort from people who are just emerging, who are wanting to be journalists and wanting to crack into the industry. But likewise, it also takes a lot of work from the people who are there to open those doors.
Yeah, and I think that's a really wonderful way to start to wind it up, because we did want to actually talk a little bit about how we might all get together after this and constructively engage on Slack or some other channel, mentor-mentee networks, internships, and regular meetups. I think perhaps, Cheryl, we can send out a survey and ask those questions. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to go about it, because I think the conversation's not finished. There's so much information and advice and support that this group of people can give. I mean, we're a pretty small group, but if you count up all the years of experience and there's, you know, everyone's willing to help. So I think it's a great idea. Probably best to wrap it up now because we are over time. First and foremost, I would like to thank you very much to Steph and Sam for joining us and sharing their stories and so much advice. Also, thank you to Rachel Bark. I very much appreciate your perspective on it as well, because it's not just, there are many kinds of media. So I think every kind is important and we need to embrace all of that. Thank you to Dan, my co-host, and also thank you for the behind the scenes support that we had from Julie Ryan to keep us all making sure that we're seeing the comments. Probably finally on the thank yous, thank you to all of you for joining and listening, but also asking really insightful questions and your enthusiasm yet again. So we will drop out a survey. That's probably next on my list of things to put together. So hopefully I'll get that out nice and soon. The other thing to talk about is if you like this and if you think it was really valuable, we would like you to consider joining Women Onside. It is a network. We've run this as a free event. We do have other events in the future that we're planning, which won't always be free, but always will be valuable. So please consider joining. The next event, I don't think we're quite ready to announce what the next event is, but I know that we have a number of great events coming forward. So just stay in touch. We will push out. You are now, given that you've registered for this event, we do have you in our database and we will push out some information. So thank you from me and all of us at Women Onside. Thanks for attending and stay safe.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.